Before we get started, hit the comments and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Whether you're catching sunrise in Nairobi, burning midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to hear from you. Don't just watch silently, let me know where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The bunker spat fire like a living thing, and the sand around Staff Sergeant Amon Pike jumped as bullets stitched the beach. He lay flat, face pressed into coral grit, tasting metal and salt. The humiliation burned worse than the shrapnel whining overhead. He had promised his squad he'd silence this ridge. Instead, the ridge laughed. The Japanese machine gun chewed the air, forcing the Marines back into a shallow scrape they called cover. Pike's radio crackled with clipped orders he couldn't answer. His loader, Lyle Mercer, lay beside him, shaking, one glove torn, blood on the cuff. The two-man weapon between them, the old, brutal launcher, felt heavier than it ever had. Pike could hear boots retreating behind him. He could feel eyes judging him. He was pinned, exposed, and failing where everyone could see. Smoke rolled down the slope like a curtain drop. Pike lifted his head an inch and saw the concrete mouth of the bunker, black and wet, framed by roots. He remembered the briefing, uncommon ground. Uncommon defenses, what he hadn't expected was the laughter, short, sharp bursts carried by wind from inside the hill. They knew the beach. They owned it. Pike's jaw tightened. He counted breaths. 1, 2. The launcher's metal was cold, slick with sweat. Mercer swallowed hard. "Sarge," he whispered, not a question. Pike didn't answer. He watched a runner stumble and fall, helmet spinning. The shame cut deep, old and familiar. He had been underestimated before. He had been told to wait. He never waited well. The sound changed. Not louder, closer. Mortar thumps walked toward them and the ground hopped. Pike's world narrowed to inches and seconds. He slid the launcher forward, inch by inch, until its weight pressed into his shoulder. Mercer crawled with him, teeth clenched, feeding the round with careful hands. The weapon was meant for two men because it demanded trust. Pike trusted Mercer with his life. He trusted his own anger even more. The bunker fired again. Dirt sprayed Pike's eyes. He blinked it clear and aimed at the shadowed slit. The ridge smelled of burned oil and wet earth. The sky was a hard blue, cruel and bright. Pike squeezed, then stopped. He saw movement to the left. Another slit. Another gun. More laughter. A lieutenant's voice broke over the radio, tight and breaking. "Hold, Pike. Hold." Pike smiled without humor. Holding meant dying slow. He shifted the aim. Mercer froze. The launcher hummed in Pike's bones. He fired. The blast punched his chest and stole the air from his lungs. The round vanished into the dark. A heartbeat. Then the bunker coughed smoke and fell silent. Cheers rose and died, when a second gun opened from higher up, raking the sand where Pike lay. He rolled, dragging the launcher, pain flaring hot along his ribs. He looked up the ridge and saw them, not one bunker but many. A honeycomb of mouths. 16, maybe more. The clock in his head started ticking. 30 minutes, he thought. Or we don't leave at all. Amon Pike learned early that silence could bruise harder than fists. The first time he was 12, standing barefoot on a cracked dock in Gull's Reach, Maine, watching his father's boat drift away without a backward glance. No goodbye. No promise. Just water slapping wood and the weight of being left to figure it out. That silence followed Pike into adulthood, settling into him like a second spine. It was why he joined the Marines. Noise made sense. Orders made sense. Pain, at least, announced itself honestly. Years later, in the training dust of Camp Calder, Pike was still that boy on the dock, except now silence came before laughter. He was small for his class, shoulders wiry, face too calm. Instructors didn't say it out loud, but the looks did. Not built for it. During Weapons Week, when the two-man launcher was rolled out, groans echoed. Heavy. Unforgiving. Pike stepped forward anyway. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "You need a partner who won't fold," he said. Pike glanced down the line and saw Lyle Mercer staring at his boots, hands shaking just a little. Pike nodded. "I got him." They failed together first. Bad angles. Late reloads. Bruised shoulders. Mercer apologized too much. Pike didn't speak at all. Then one night, after lights out, Pike hauled the launcher behind the barracks and practiced by moonlight. Mercer showed up with bandaged fingers and stayed. They learned each other's breathing. Learned the rhythm. Pike counted heartbeats. Mercer counted clicks. The laughter faded. The silence became theirs, sharp and useful. When they finally passed, the instructor didn't smile. He just wrote their names down slower than the others. Back on the ridge, Pike remembered that night as another mortar hit shook the earth. He crawled with Mercer into a pocket of shadow under a bent palm. Mercer's face was gray, eyes wide. "There's more," he said, unnecessary. Pike nodded. He studied the slope. The Japanese bunkers weren't random, they spoke to each other. Fire overlapped like woven wire. Pike saw the pattern. He felt it lock into place. Shame cooled into focus. "We don't go straight," Pike said. "We go sideways. We make them look where we were." They moved when the guns paused. Smoke hung low, hiding their crawl. Pike scraped coral with his elbows, counting, always counting. The first bunker they'd silenced was already waking. A helmet peaked. Pike fired again, quick, clean. The mouth went dark. No cheer this time. Just work. Mercer reloaded with steady hands. The ridge groaned as if it felt the change. Somewhere above, a whistle blew, sharp, angry. Pike smiled thinly. They'd noticed. A runner slid down the sand, breathless. "Orders?" he gasped. Pike shook his head. "Tell him we're busy." The runner stared, then ran. Pike rolled, aimed higher. Another shot. Another silence. The laughter was gone now. Replaced by shouts, boots, confusion. Pike felt the clock tick louder. He wasn't brave. He was angry in a careful way. Angry for the boy on the dock. Angry for the men pinned behind him. Angry for Mercer, who had been told he'd never hold steady. By the time the third bunker fell, Pike's shoulder burned and his ears rang. Mercer's lip bled where he'd bitten it. They didn't stop. They couldn't. Pike glanced at his watch. 24 minutes left. He looked up the ridge and saw shadows shifting, guns swinging to chase ghosts. He whispered, almost kindly, "Follow me." And the hill did. The ridge answered Pike's defiance with fury. Tracer rounds stitched the smoke, red lines carving the gray like angry signatures. Pike and Mercer hugged the earth as bullets snapped overhead, close enough to feel the heat pass their ears. The beach behind them had gone strangely quiet, not safe, just waiting. Marines watched from shell holes and broken palms, counting on the two figures crawling uphill with a weapon built for stopping tanks. Pike felt their hope like a weight on his back. He didn't look behind. If he did, he might slow. Slowing was a luxury the ridge didn't allow. They slid into a shallow crease where rain had once cut the hill. Pike pressed his cheek to the dirt and listened. The bunkers spoke now in short bursts, panicked and uneven. Someone up there was shouting orders. Someone else was swearing. Pike pictured faces he couldn't see and felt a flash of something like pity. It passed. He lifted his head and traced the lines again. Overlap. Blind spot. A seam. "There," he said. Mercer followed his finger, nodded once. No questions. Trust had replaced fear. It always did when fear stayed too long. As they crawled, Pike remembered another name written in dust. *** Corporal Rafe Nolan ***, crossed out on a chalkboard back at Camp Calder. Nolan had washed out on the launcher, shoulder torn, pride worse. The night before he left, he'd slapped Pike's helmet and said, "You make it look easy." Pike had wanted to laugh. Easy was surviving long enough to learn where to put your hands. Easy was counting so the world didn't count you out. Pike swallowed and moved. The fourth bunker sat lower than the others, its slit camouflaged with palm fronds and mud. Pike waited for the rhythm, then popped up just long enough to fire. The blast punched smoke into the sky. Silence followed, thick and final. Mercer reloaded fast. Pike rolled, already aiming higher. The fifth bunker fired late, a wild spray that cut nothing but air. Pike took it anyway. He fired. Another mouth closed. He didn't smile. He marked it in his head like a tally scratched on wood. The Japanese response sharpened. Grenades thumped downhill, dirt raining. One landed close enough to lift Pike off the ground. He hit hard, stars bursting. For a breathless second, the world went white. Mercer was on him instantly, hands checking, voice urgent. Pike blinked, shook it off. His ears screamed. He could taste blood. He grabbed the launcher again. "I'm good," he said, though he wasn't sure. Good was relative. Alive counted. They shifted left, then right, then left again, never twice the same way. Pike felt the ridge start to chase echoes. Guns swung late. Orders overlapped. Confusion bred gaps. Pike loved gaps. He filled them with fire. The sixth bunker fell. Then the seventh. With each shot, the weapon bucked and Pike's shoulder screamed louder, a hot, grinding pain that threatened to steal his arm. He ignored it. Pain was loud but temporary. Failure stayed. A scream cut through the smoke, Japanese close. Pike froze. Mercer did too. Boots pounded. A squad rushed the crease, bayonets glinting. Pike's heart kicked hard. He had one round loaded. No room to miss. He waited until the shadows broke into shapes. He fired point blank. The blast flattened everything. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing moving but leaves drifting down. Pike stared, breath ragged. Mercer swallowed, eyes shiny. "Keep going," Pike said, softer than before. They reached a ledge that offered a brief, precious view. Pike saw the whole hill now, a puzzle half solved. 16 mouths. 7 quiet. 9 angry. He checked his watch with a shaking hand. 17 minutes left. He felt the ridge watching him back, measuring. Somewhere up there, a decision was being made. Pike rested his forehead against the launcher and breathed once, deep. Names, he thought. "I'll write your names in dust." And then he moved. The hill did not forget pain. It learned from it. As Pike and Mercer crawled higher, the air changed, thicker, hotter, charged with intent. The Japanese defenders had stopped firing wildly. Now the guns spoke with discipline. Short bursts. Controlled arcs. The ridge was thinking. Pike felt a flicker of respect, unwanted but real. These weren't shadows anymore. These were soldiers adapting under fire just like him. He wiped sweat from his eyes and left a smear of red across his cheek. The hill smelled of burned cordite and crushed leaves. Somewhere above, a bugle sounded once, sharp and mournful, then cut off. They reached a shallow saddle where the ground dipped between two rises. Pike pressed his back against rock and listened to his own breathing. Mercer crouched beside him, jaw tight, hands steady despite the tremor in his knees. "We're low on rounds," Mercer said quietly. Pike nodded. He'd been counting. Counting was comfort. "We don't need many," Pike replied. "Just the right ones." A memory surfaced, uninvited. Pike at 17, standing in a courthouse hallway while his mother argued for a signature she never got. The judge hadn't looked at him once. Adults talked over him like he was furniture. That was when Pike learned something important. If you wanted to be seen, you had to move the room. The hill was a room full of men who had decided he didn't matter. Pike intended to rearrange it. The 8th bunker revealed itself by mistake. A runner tripped, helmet clanging against concrete. Pike saw the slit flare open. He didn't hesitate. He fired from the hip. The blast echoed like a drum in a canyon. The runner vanished. The slit went dark. Mercer reloaded on instinct alone. Pike rolled, already shifting because staying still was an invitation. A bullet punched the rock where his head had been a second earlier. The hill was angry now. They climbed through a stand of scrub that tore at their sleeves. Pike felt the launcher grow heavier with every step. His shoulder burned, then went numb. That scared him more than pain. He shook his arm, forced blood back into it. Mercer glanced at him, worry flickering. Pike shook his head once. Later the look said. There was no later. Only up. The 9th bunker was different. Larger, reinforced, its mouth framed by steel. Pike studied it and felt doubt press in, heavy and cold. He pushed it away. Doubt was a luxury too. He waited for the firing pattern, then aimed for the seam where steel met old concrete. He fired. The explosion bloomed bright, violent. When the smoke cleared, the bunker still stood, but the gun inside did not. Silence again. Pike exhaled hard. Close enough counted. A voice shouted in English from somewhere behind them. "Pike, get back. That's an order." Pike didn't turn. Orders were for people who could afford them. He crawled forward, dragging the launcher like a stubborn animal. Mercer followed without being told. Trust again. Always trust. The 10th bunker fell fast. The 11th fought back. A round clipped Pike's helmet, spinning him sideways. He tasted dirt and copper. For a terrifying second he couldn't feel his legs. Then sensation flooded back, sharp and welcome. He laughed once, short, almost hysterical, and shoved himself up. Mercer grabbed his sleeve. "Amen," he said, using his name for the first time. Pike met his eyes. In them he saw fear and belief. He nodded. That was enough. They crested another rise and froze. Above them, arranged like teeth in a grin, were the remaining bunkers, 5 of them closer together, guns already swinging down. Pike checked his watch. 8 minutes left. The hill had tightened its fist. Pike rested the launcher on his knee and breathed. He felt the boy on the dock behind him, the instructor's stare, the laughter from the dark. He stood anyway. "Sideways," he whispered. Then straight through. The guns opened fire. The first burst tore the air where Pike's head had been. He dove, shoulder screaming as the launcher slammed into rock. Dust swallowed them whole. The sound was everywhere, guns hammering, bullets snapping, stone chipping. Mercer crawled into Pike's side, breathing fast but controlled, hands already working the weapon like muscle memory had taken over his fear. Pike pressed his face into the dirt and counted again. Not heartbeats this time. Seconds. 8 minutes. That was all the hill would give him. He popped up, fired at the leftmost bunker and rolled before the echo finished. The blast chewed the concrete lip and showered the slit with debris. Not dead but blinking. Pike used the blink. He fired again, this time at the second bunker, higher, forcing the guns to split their attention. Confusion rippled through the ridge. Orders shouted. Boots ran. Pike felt the pattern loosen. That was the crack he needed. Mercer's voice cut through the noise. 2 rounds left. Pike nodded. He already knew. The weapon felt lighter now, not because it was, but because decision had burned away hesitation. He crawled forward into a pocket of shadow beneath a boulder, close enough to smell oil and sweat from the bunkers above. He could hear them breathing. He could hear fear now, sharp and human. It didn't make him feel better. It made him move faster. A memory surfaced. Mercer in the barracks, months ago, reading a letter twice before folding it small. My kid thinks I fix trucks, Mercer had said, embarrassed. Pike had nodded. You do, he'd replied. Just bigger ones. Mercer had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. He was steady. Pike trusted that steadiness more than his own strength. Pike rose just enough to fire at the center bunker. The blast was perfect. Concrete cracked like a dropped plate. The gun inside went quiet. 3 left. The hill screamed back. Bullets chewed the boulder, stone biting Pike's cheek. He felt warm blood slide down his neck. He ignored it. He had 1 round left. One choice. The remaining bunkers adjusted, guns overlapping tighter than before. Pike studied them through smoke and heat shimmer. He saw it, the mistake. They were watching where he'd been, not where he would be. Pike crawled sideways, slow, deliberate, counting breaths. Mercer followed, silent. Pike stood in full view, a heartbeat of madness, and fired at the seam between the last 2 bunkers. The explosion was enormous. Fire and dust leapt together. One bunker collapsed inward. The other went blind, its gun mangled and useless. Silence crashed down, sudden and unreal. Pike sagged to his knees. The launcher slipped from his hands. His shoulder was numb. His ears rang like bells. Mercer grabbed him before he fell, laughing and crying at the same time. You did it, Mercer said, voice breaking. Pike shook his head, dizzy. We did. Boots thundered uphill. Marines poured past them, whooping, shouting, slapping Pike's helmet as they went. A lieutenant skidded to a stop, staring at the quiet mouths in disbelief. How many? He asked. Pike blinked, trying to focus. He checked his watch with a trembling hand. 30 minutes. Exactly. 16, he said simply. As medics reached them, Pike looked back down the hill. The beach was alive now, men moving forward, unpinned, breathing again. The hill still smoked, but it no longer laughed. Pike closed his eyes just for a second and let himself breathe. The quiet felt wrong. Pike lay on a stretcher near the tree-line, listening to the wind comb through palms, waiting for the hill to speak again. It didn't. Medics cut away his sleeve, their hands gentle, voices low. Mercer hovered nearby, helmet off, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes never leaving Pike's face. You scared me, Mercer said, trying to sound casual. Pike smiled thinly. Get in line. The medic pressed gauze to Pike's shoulder, pain blooming bright and sharp. Pike welcomed it. Pain meant here. Meant now. It meant he hadn't stayed on the dock. Command arrived with clipboards and questions. A major knelt, studied the silent bunkers, then looked at Pike like he was measuring a bridge that shouldn't stand. You disobeyed orders, the major said. Pike nodded once. The truth didn't scare him. The major sighed, tired. You also saved a lot of men. He stood and walked away without another word. Pike closed his eyes. Praise never fit him well. It slid off, leaving the weight underneath. As dusk crept in, the ridge changed color, ash to violet to bruised blue. Bodies were counted. Names were written. Pike watched Marines move with a quiet purpose that felt almost reverent. Someone brought Mercer a canteen. He drank, then handed it to Pike. The water tasted like rust and life. My kid, Mercer said suddenly. I'm going to tell him the truth. Pike nodded. Tell him you fixed the hill. Mercer laughed softly. The sound cracked something open in Pike's chest. He looked away, embarrassed by the wetness in his eyes. Night fell fast. Too fast. The first flare rose like a slow, burning moon. Shouts followed. Japanese soldiers, those who hadn't been in the bunkers, were probing the line, desperate and quiet. The hill wasn't done. Pike sat up despite the medic's protest, grabbed his rifle and slid off the stretcher. Mercer was already there, helmet back on, fear replaced by focus. "Together," Mercer said. Pike nodded. Together made sense. They took positions behind a low wall of broken stone. The night smelled of damp earth and fear. Pike's shoulder protested every movement, but his hands were steady. Shadows slipped between trees. Pike fired once. A shadow fell. Another moved. Mercer covered the gap. The fight was brief, sharp, and close. When it ended, the night went still again, heavier than before. Pike leaned back, breath ragged, stars wheeling overhead. He felt older. He felt lighter. Just before dawn, a runner arrived with news. The ridge was secure. The beachhead held. Reinforcements were moving inland. Pike listened, nodding, the words passing through him like wind through wire. What stayed were faces. Nolan's grin. Mercer's hands. The boy on the dock, finally turning to look back. Pike sat as the sky paled and let the morning find him. The first light of morning was cold, creeping over the ridge like a promise. Pike sat with his back against a crumbling rock, eyes tired but sharp. His rifle lay beside him, still smoking from the last firefight. The air smelled of earth and ash, of gunpowder and the ocean salt that never fully left. The Marines had already begun the quiet work of clearing the dead, marking the fallen and counting victories. But Pike knew the real work was still ahead. For him, the war wasn't over just because the guns fell silent. Mercer came up behind him, his face drawn and tired, but with that same quiet steadiness in his eyes. He sat down beside Pike, close enough to share warmth, but not so close as to crowd him. For a long time neither of them spoke. The world was still settling, adjusting to the aftermath. Pike could hear the distant hum of engines, the muffled sounds of men shouting orders. Yet here, at the top of the ridge, there was only the wind and the distant crash of waves. "Lyle," Pike said after a moment, his voice rough. "You ever wonder what happens to the ones who go silent?" Mercer glanced at him, eyes narrowing slightly, the question hanging between them like smoke. "What do you mean?" Pike didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his gaze wander over the silent battlefield, the bunkers they'd taken, the men they'd saved, the men they'd lost. He thought of Nolan, of the others who had failed, and of the ones who would never hear their names spoken again. "I mean," Pike continued, "the ones who didn't make it back. Who get forgotten or erased. You think they'll be remembered?" Mercer was quiet for a long while. His gaze was distant, searching the horizon as if trying to find the right words. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice soft. "Maybe we do the remembering for them. Maybe that's how they live on. Not in the stories or the speeches, but in the ones who carry their ghosts." Pike nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The silence stretched on, comfortable in its understanding. He knew Mercer was right. They would remember. They had no choice. The first rays of sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows over the wreckage. A squad of Marines appeared, moving with the efficient quiet of men who had seen enough. Pike didn't stand immediately. Instead, he looked down at the dirt beneath his boots, where his hands had clawed for purchase, where his knees had scraped against stone. This was where he'd fought, where he'd bled, where he'd survived. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Pike." He looked up, startled. The major from earlier was standing at the edge of the clearing, clipboard in hand, his gaze steady but unsentimental. "The ridge is secure," the major said, his voice low. "You've done your job." Pike didn't respond immediately. His chest tightened. He wasn't used to praise and he wasn't used to being dismissed so casually. There was something empty about the major's words, an acknowledgement without understanding. Pike felt that familiar knot in his stomach tighten. "We lost too many," Pike said, his voice hoarse. "The ones who didn't make it. They won't be counted in any report." The major paused, considering him for a moment. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something softer, almost apologetic. "I know. But the rest of us are still here. And that's how we honor them. By living. By moving forward." Pike felt a weight settle in his chest, heavier than the exhaustion that had begun to creep through his limbs. Moving forward. He didn't know if he could. He didn't know if the pain would ever stop. As the Marines began to gather their gear, Pike stood, forcing his aching body into motion. His shoulder was still a raw, tender mess, but he ignored it. He had no time to dwell on pain. Not yet. Not until it was all over. Until the fight was done. Mercer stood as well, glancing at Pike with a silent understanding. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Together they walked down the ridge, side by side, through the remains of the battle. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, But the distant sound of engines reminded them that the fight was far from over. They had made their mark on this hill, but this war, was far from finished. As they reached the base of the ridge, Pike stopped for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel it then, the weight of the men who had gone before him and the ghosts they had left behind. He would carry them. He would carve their names into stone, into his memory, so they would never fade. And in that moment, for the first time since the battle began, Pike allowed himself to breathe. The ridge might have forgotten, but he never would. The morning fog hadn't lifted when Pike and Mercer returned to the base of the ridge. The Marines were moving up to consolidate, but Pike's eyes were drawn back to the hill, a scarred, smoking labyrinth of concrete mouths that still held the last 5 bunkers. Every second counted. Every second without action allowed the enemy to regroup, to trap their brothers in another death trap. Pike wiped the sweat from his brow and felt Mercer's hand on his shoulder. "Ready?" Mercer asked, voice tight but steady. Pike nodded. Ready or not, the hill wouldn't wait. They moved up fast this time, the launcher between them like a living thing. The smoke clung to their uniforms, paint-streaked and torn, as if the ridge itself wanted to erase their presence. Pike felt the weight of every second, every breath, every heartbeat. The 8th bunker had already been weakened by earlier blasts. The 9th still spat rounds and jittered bursts. The 10th and 11th had structural cracks that begged to be exploited. But it wasn't just structure. It was timing, patience, precision. Pike whispered instructions to Mercer in clipped phrases, short, direct, like bullets themselves. Mercer followed, trust absolute. As they approached the 10th bunker, a mortar round exploded nearby, showering sand and rock. Pike hit the ground, coughing, tasting grit and iron. Mercer was already pressing forward, dragging him along. Pike rose onto one knee, launcher aimed at the weakest seam. He counted in his head, 3 beats, and fired. The bunker shuddered, concrete splintering, smoke roaring from the slit. Another round fired almost immediately from the 11th bunker. Pike rolled left, fired blind, hitting the earth just below the bunker's gun, forcing the defenders to duck. Every move was calculated, every breath precious. A Japanese soldier emerged from the last remaining bunker, rifle raised, panic written across his face. Pike didn't hesitate. He fired. The explosion swallowed the soldier's position. The remaining bunkers were silent now, broken, mangled, defeated. The ridge was still, holding its breath. Pike lowered the launcher, feeling it vibrate against his shoulder. Mercer crouched beside him, shaking, exhausted, eyes wide. "We did it," Mercer whispered. Pike nodded, voice caught in his throat. 16, he said simply. The ridge seemed to exhale. Smoke and dust rolled down the slope like a tide, revealing the damage they had done. Cracked concrete, shattered helmets, scorched earth. Marines began moving up, securing the hill, but Pike didn't move. He stared at the silent bunkers, at the mouths that had laughed and shot at them and then fallen quiet. His body ached from shoulder to hip, his lungs burned from dust and adrenaline, but his heart had never felt steadier. The ridge had tested him, humiliated him, tried to break him, but in 30 minutes he had rewritten its rules. Mercer grabbed his sleeve, pulling him to his feet. Pike looked down at his hands, blackened, raw, shaking. Mercer smiled faintly. "We survived," he said. Pike allowed himself the barest of nods. "We survived," he repeated. And for the first time the weight of the hill felt different, not oppressive, not mocking, but conquered. The last 5 bunkers were no longer threats. They were monuments to the price paid and the courage earned. Pike closed his eyes, feeling every second of the battle settle into memory, carved into him like a stone. 30 minutes, 16 bunkers, 1 Marine, and a story that would never be forgotten. The final bunker collapse sent dust spiraling into the air, blotting out the rising sun. Pike's shoulders screamed with every breath, his muscles trembling like frayed rope. Mercer leaned against him, sweat and ash streaking their faces, silent witnesses to the chaos they had just survived. Around them, the Marines cautiously advanced, scanning the ruined ridge for any sign of movement. But there was none. The Japanese were gone. The hill had been beaten into submission. And yet, Pike didn't feel victory. He felt the weight of 30 minutes of hell pressing against his chest, of bodies saved and lost, of decisions made in a heartbeat that could have ended everything. "Pike," a voice called from below. A lieutenant stumbled up, panic etched in his eyes. "We need to secure the ridge. Reinforcements are moving in, but there are reports of snipers further up." Pike didn't move immediately. He stared at the twisted wreckage of bunkers, at the scorched earth beneath him, at the sweat dripping into his eyes. For a moment the world was nothing but noise and ash. Then he nodded. "We finish it," he said, voice rough but unwavering. Mercer gave a short, sharp nod. Together they moved. The last 5 bunkers were still crawling with small pockets of resistance, desperate men firing blindly, hoping to scare away the ghosts of smoke and fire. Pike and Mercer advanced, launcher raised, each step measured, each breath calculated. Pike fired first at a slit on the northern edge, collapsing the weak wall and sending the enemy scrambling for cover. Mercer followed, covering the right side with precise rounds, their rhythm synchronized like a single heartbeat. Time slowed, stretched, until each bunker's destruction was both immediate and eternal. A grenade bounced near Pike's boot, spraying dirt and rock. Instinctively he kicked it aside and fired, silencing a rifle team emerging from cover. The ridge shook as if protesting their dominance, but Pike pressed forward. The last bunker loomed above them, reinforced, fortified, and unyielding. Pike's shoulder ached violently with every movement, but he ignored it. Mercer whispered, "This is it," and Pike gave a curt nod. He counted the beats, 3, 4, 5, and fired directly at the seam between steel and concrete. The bunker exploded in a cascade of rock, smoke, and twisted metal. For a moment silence fell, absolute and heavy. Pike's body sagged, muscles trembling, lungs burning. Mercer leaned against the ruined wall, wiping blood and sweat from his eyes. "We did it," Mercer said, voice breaking. Pike barely nodded. Victory was a quiet thing measured in dust and blood, not cheers. But the ridge, once alive with enemy fire, laughter, and death, was theirs. They had survived 30 minutes that would be remembered forever, a testament to trust, precision, and sheer will. Marines poured onto the ridge, securing the last bunkers, checking the fallen, and helping the wounded. Pike sank to his knees, gripping the launcher one last time. Every scar, every bruise, every aching muscle was proof. He had not been perfect. He had been afraid. He had been human. But he had faced the ridge alone with Mercer at his side, and nothing, not even 16 bunkers, had stopped him. As the wind swept through the hill, carrying the scent of ash and salt, Pike closed his eyes. The battle was over. The ridge had spoken. And for the first time, the boy who had once been abandoned on the dock felt like he had been exactly where he was meant to be. The edge of exhaustion had become the pinnacle of survival. In 30 minutes, 16 bunkers, 1 two-man weapon, and 2 Marines had changed everything. The day that followed felt strangely muted. The noise of the battle had faded, replaced by the mechanical sound of engines grinding along the dirt roads, of men moving through the aftermath with quiet, purposeful steps. Pike sat on a rock near the wreckage of the last bunker, the weight of the weapon still heavy in his hands, though the fight had ended. He could feel the sun starting to scorch his skin, the heat mixing with the cold of his exhaustion. His body ached and every muscle screamed to stop moving. But there was no rest yet. Not for him. Not for Mercer. The ridge still held its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. Mercer came to sit beside him, holding a canteen in his hands, though neither of them drank. There was nothing to say. The victory was hard-earned, but it wasn't complete. Pike's eyes scanned the hillside, the same one that had nearly swallowed them whole just hours before. The bunkers were gone, but the cost lingered. Their brothers who hadn't made it. The faces of the dead. The feeling of terror and rage that had driven them forward. Pike clenched his fists, trying to keep the ghosts from surfacing. "You ever think about how long this'll stick with us?" Mercer asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, strained in a way that only came after a fight like that. Pike turned to him, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that went deeper than the skin. The kind that changed people. "I don't know," Pike said quietly. He didn't have the answer. "I think about what comes next. About making sure this place stays ours. That we finish what we started. We make sure the ones who didn't make it." He broke off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The names would hang there, unspoken, forever. Mercer nodded, his eyes distant. "I don't know if I'll ever forget it," he murmured. "I thought, maybe after it was all over I'd feel like we'd earned something. But I don't. I feel empty." He glanced over at Pike. "You think we'll ever be able to forget?" Pike's gaze dropped to his hands, rough and bruised. His mind was filled with images of sand and blood, smoke and fire, the deafening roar of the launcher and the silence after every explosion. He shook his head slowly. "Maybe not. But we keep moving. We keep surviving. We remember the ones we lost, and we carry them forward with us." Mercer didn't say anything more. They both just sat there watching the Marines work. Some of them were patching up wounds, Others were already beginning to dismantle the bunkers, as if the physical destruction of the place could somehow undo the emotional damage it had caused. But Pike knew better. You couldn't destroy a memory. Not like that. The ridge would live in their minds forever, as would the price they had paid for it. There were some things that couldn't be erased. And then, as if the world had decided it was time for them to breathe, a helicopter hovered overhead, its blades slicing the air with a sharp, rhythmic hum. The sound was deafening, but to Pike, it felt like the first sound of peace he'd heard in what felt like a lifetime. The chopper touched down, stirring up a cloud of dust. A figure in a crisp uniform jumped out and walked toward them. It was the major, the one who had been overseeing the operation from below. He approached Pike and Mercer, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, then the major finally spoke. "You both did something extraordinary up there," the major said, his voice surprisingly soft. "But you're not done yet. We've still got work to do." He paused, eyeing the two Marines carefully. "The ridge is secure. But there's a larger war to fight. The mission's far from over. And you're both needed." Pike nodded, feeling the weight of the major's words like another heavy load on his already aching shoulders. He didn't know what lay ahead, what more would be asked of him, of Mercer, of the others, but he knew one thing for certain: they would carry on. There was no choice but to move forward. The ghosts of the fallen would always be with him, but so too would be the strength of those who fought beside him. The Marines who had made it through together. Mercer looked at Pike, a small, tired smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Pike returned the smile, though it felt like a grimace, the corners of his lips stiff from exhaustion. "Let's finish it," Pike said quietly. Mercer nodded. "Together." And with that they walked back toward the helicopter, toward whatever came next. The war was still waiting. But so were they. And in that moment, for the first time in hours, Pike allowed himself to believe they just might be able to finish this.